Hello, everyone. This is the fourth and final segment of my interview with Professor Dale Allison, who is Professor of New Testament Studies at Princeton Theological Seminary. We've been discussing his new book, The Resurrection of Jesus: Apologetics, Polemics, History. At the end of our previous segment, I quoted Professor Allison saying the conclusion that God raised Jesus cancels some options such as atheism. However, it does not confirm the Christian view over, say, the Buddhist and Hindu views. I agreed with Professor Allison that the historian cannot conclude God raised Jesus. That is a theological explanation, and the historian has no tools at their hands in order to confirm that God raised Jesus. They can have their own opinions on the subject, of course, but they can't confirm that God was the cause behind the resurrection of Jesus because they just don't have the tools to verify it. Professor Allison replied that he thinks my worldview interferes with my judgment as a historian. He says this is because skeptics provide any number of naturalistic explanations for the data, such as grave robbers stole the body of Jesus from the corpse. Mary experienced a hallucination of Jesus, and in view of the empty tomb, she interpreted the appearance of Jesus as resurrection, whereas it was only a hallucination. And the appearance to the more than 500 was just simply something they saw in cloud formations at the same time. Now, he concluded, he said, so the skeptical historian has an out without being a total loser because their explanations aren't as implausible as I may think. Now, I said to Professor Allison at that point that I wanted to push back on that. And so, Professor Allison, here are my thoughts on the matter. For me, it's not a matter of the skeptical historian being a total loser because they can come up with some sort of naturalistic hypotheses to account for the same data as I would within the resurrection hypothesis. For me, it's a matter of historians applying strictly controlled historical method. And in doing so, they will use arguments of inference to the best explanation, employing criteria such as which hypothesis can account for the better number of facts, which hypothesis can do so account for those facts without forcing them to fit the hypothesis, or stated a little differently, given the truth of that hypothesis, do we get what we would expect in terms of the data? We want a hypothesis that is less ad hoc than competing hypotheses, and we want the preferred hypothesis to be compatible with our background knowledge. And the hypothesis that best fulfills these criteria should be regarded as what probably occurred. Now, when we subject the resurrection hypothesis and all these other naturalistic hypotheses, such as someone stole the body, hallucinations, etc., in my opinion, the resurrection hypothesis comes out far better than any other hypothesis, competing naturalistic hypothesis. Now, skeptical historians will typically rule out a spiritual dimension of reality. I regard that as a handicap that they place on themselves, but I'm not obligated to embrace that same handicap and join them in it. In contrast, I'm willing as a historian to bracket my worldview, and I'm not going to a priori assume a spiritual dimension of reality, nor a priori reject a spiritual dimension of reality. Instead, I'm going to do my best to allow the facts to speak for themselves. Otherwise, we place ourselves as historians in a precarious position where we allow the worldviews we embrace to guide our decisions. We allow that to be the umpire rather than the data itself. And the danger of this is manifest. Bad philosophy corrupts good history. So that's why I think it's the important matter here is to utilize strictly controlled historical method to see which hypothesis best explains the facts. The one that does is what we should regard as what probably occurred. And now I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on this approach.
Well, I think this is an extremely complex issue, and I don't think we're going to get very far here on a podcast. But I think that a reasonable response to you would be this. First of all, uh, most historical events don't have single causes. There's no single cause of World War I or the Civil War or why I married my wife. And so there's no problem at all. In fact, it's the rule that you explain single events through multiple causes. Then the second thing the historian would do would be to say, you know what, this shotgun approach, I have this and I have that and so on, which you think is ad hoc. I think the historian or a certain type of historian would say, everything that I'm saying has parallels, whereas nothing you say has a parallel. For example, we know of empty tombs that were emptied because of people stealing bodies. And we do know that people hallucinate frequently. We also know from the study of messianic movements that people sometimes claim the fulfillment of prophecy when, to all appearances, it wasn't fulfilled. So everything in the skeptical explanation has parallels, whereas everything in yours is without parallel. That is, you have to say, God did this, God did that, God did this, or Jesus was the agent, and so on. So I think that would be the
I
response.
don't have to say that, though. I don't have to say God or Jesus did it.
Okay, but to say Jesus rose from the dead, okay, forget the agent, Jesus rose from the dead, and that explains all these things. That is to invoke a cause that doesn't have parallels, whereas the other does not. And maybe if you would look at some other case at Mormonism, it would be helpful here. So I'm not a Mormon. I don't buy into the Mormon worldview, but when I try to explain early Mormonism, I have to explain several things. I have to explain Joseph's vision of the angel. I have to explain the golden tablets. I have to explain why an unlettered person could produce this book. I have to explain why 3 people swore they held the tablets, and why 8 others, saw them, and why this movement flourished even though, the odds were against it. So a Mormon would say, I think there's one explanation for all those things. God was with Joseph. He was a prophet. You could say God was with Joseph. He was a prophet. That explains all those things. Since I'm not a Mormon, I actually have 6 or 7 different explanations. It's a scattershot approach. I say, well, Joseph was of this character. This is how I explain the golden tablets, and so on and so on. So I don't think that's unreasonable. But that's off the top of my head. That's how I think I would respond. But I'm not sure. I'd have to give it more thought.
Okay, fair enough. I'll move on from there.
Okay.
At one point in your chapter on rainbow bodies, you answer Gary Habermas's contentions about parallels in an article he wrote several years ago. You say the following, and let me quote: "In my judgment, which is hardly idiosyncratic, not a single canonical gospel was penned by an eyewitness of Jesus' ministry. This leaves, when it comes to Jesus' resurrection, Paul as our sole first-hand source. In his extant correspondence, however, he says next to nothing concrete about his inaugural vision of Jesus, nor does he offer any details about Jesus' tomb or events associated with it. The only Pauline passage to offer details about the resurrection is 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, much of which is the composition of someone whose identity escapes us. In the end, then, how much reliable historical data from early eyewitness sources against which later claims can be critically compared and ascertained do we truly have?" End quote. Now, when I read this, I'm thinking, wow, that sounds a lot like something Bart Ehrman would say. And I know you're not as skeptical about the sources as Bart, but, I want to say a couple things in response to that and get your feedback. So because I think that these sources, my thoughts are these sources tell us more than maybe what you're willing to grant there. So in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 1, Paul says, I want to remind you of the gospel message I preached to you and Gelidzo. And then after he goes through this oral formula, this creed or whatever you may want to call it, in chapter 15, verses 3-7, and then verse 8, Paul adds his own testimony about Jesus appearing to him. In verse 11 says, whether I or they've just talked about death, burial, resurrection, and appearances to individuals and groups. And Paul says, whether I or they, referring to the other apostles, this is what we preach, kerugma, or keruso there with the verb. This is what we preach. This is what you believed. And then in verses 12 and 14, he also uses the term, the kerygma there. So I take that as Paul saying, this is what I've just told you. This is the essence of the apostolic preaching here. This is what the Jerusalem apostles are proclaiming as well. They're claiming death, burial, resurrection, and appearances of Jesus. And indeed, when we go to Galatians chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, we find Paul at an earlier date appearing before the pillars of the church. He names them Peter, James, and John, and running the gospel message he had preached to them, had been preaching, to make sure he was on message with them. And Paul says that they verified that he was preaching the same thing they're preaching. So my thoughts, Dale, are this, and this is like the first and two building blocks I want to raise before you. This first building block is when we hear Paul on the resurrection of Jesus, and throughout that chapter in 15 and elsewhere, like in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, and in Romans chapter 8, verse 10, etc., Paul seems to believe in a physical, bodily, raised Jesus. And if that's what he believed, then since the apostles are preaching the same thing about the resurrection, I don't think it's much of a leap at all to say that they're preaching the same thing, that Jesus was raised bodily, physically from the dead. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that, but I don't think that you've contradicted what I said. What there's a difference between
I agree.
There's a difference between an inference, which is what you're making, and eyewitness testimony, which we do not have. And
except Paul.
Except for Paul. But the inference you make, I agree with. I've argued at great length in the book that Paul thought in terms of a physical resurrection. And I've actually argued in the book that this is what we have in Judaism in the first century. That is, people who talked about resurrection typically meant resurrection of corpses or bodies. They were thinking of dust and graves and so on. So I don't disagree with you. My point is that this is an inference, okay?
Okay.
But it's not eyewitness testimony.
Except for Paul.
Except for Paul. But again, he doesn't tell you a whole lot. Acts is much more interesting. Acts is much more interesting when it comes to Paul's conversion than Paul is.
Sure. And, you know, I acknowledge here that I may be interpreting your words in a sense through my lens of interacting with skeptics on a regular basis and what they say. All right. So in this sense, you'll be able to correct me. But let me go to my second building block here. The second building block has to do with the Gospels. Now, I know you say here that you don't believe any of the Gospels, and of course, church tradition is that Matthew and John were written by eyewitnesses. Mark and Luke, there's no one that are saying Mark and Luke are eyewitnesses, and you reject the traditional authorship of Matthew and John. So you say they're not written by eyewitnesses. But I know from conversation I've had with you in the past, as well as a paper that I attended that you read at SBL in Chicago a few years ago, that although you reject the traditional authorship of the Gospel of John written by John, the son of Zebedee, you do think that one of the evangelist's major sources for that gospel is John, the son of Zebedee. So at least we could say that portions of John's gospel are rooted in eyewitness testimony. And I think you would probably, I don't want to say something that you don't believe here, but I would guess that you think that the synoptics are also to an extent rooted in eyewitness testimony, even if not written by an eyewitness. Are both of those fair assessments?
So anything that's historical in the Gospels has to go back to eyewitnesses. There's no way that it's there otherwise. So yes, I grant that there is material that is descended from eyewitnesses.
Okay.
Okay.
Now,
Well, yeah. So let me try this on you. So
Oh,
let's
hold on a
say,
second, because I want to
okay,
just follow up just
okay,
a little bit more with this. I'm almost there. Okay.
okay, all right.
So I know that although you are skeptical of the ability of the criteria of authenticity in the historical Jesus, you are skeptical of its ability to yield a whole lot about Jesus. I know you still like the criterion of multiple attestation when we talk about the motif. Um, and even if John and Matthew and none of the Gospels, even if it's the case that none of them are written by eyewitnesses, you do have multiple attestation of independent sources in terms of a motif concerning an empty tomb, um, concerning bodily resurrected. You've got Jesus. I do think the appearances in Mark, I don't know what happened with Mark's ending and stuff. That's irrelevant for now. But Matthew, Luke, and John, at least, they see Jesus as someone you could touch, someone who eats or prepares a meal, someone with whom you can converse. And I'm not trying at this point with you to say that, we can trust everything in there that happened as written, but you do have multiple independent sources in terms of a motif here. With a bodily raised Jesus, he can do these kinds of things, like you can touch his body, he eats, all that. There's an empty tomb. And that seems to me that is congruent with Paul's view of resurrection, something that happens to the corpse. It's now transformed into an immortal body. It's the corpse, though, that is physically transformed into that. So here, my bottom line point is this, and I'm sorry it took me a little bit to get there. My bottom line is this. When I read that paragraph that I did of yours earlier, it seems that you are very pessimistic about the sources. Again, I could be reading that through the lens having in mind people like Ehrman and so forth, and you may not mean it in exactly the same sense. But I guess I'm just not as pessimistic that about those sources giving us what I perceive that you're saying there. Thoughts?
Okay, well, there's a lot to say there. Again, to go back to something I said earlier, I think my conclusions are embarrassingly antediluvian. I can't. It's very hard for me to think of myself as a skeptic here, but I don't trust the details of the accounts the way you do. So first of all, I would say Mark is not irrelevant. I would say that it's the earliest account we have, and we don't know how it ended. I agree that the tomb is empty, and the text assumes that Jesus exited the tomb, but that doesn't tell me anything about what Mark thought of appearances. Okay, so that's just the first thing. Mark is a blank and irrelevant. The second thing is I'm not sure.
Do you really think he's irrelevant, though?
Yes,
I mean,
for the
I'm thinking
appearance tradition. For the appearance tradition, I don't see that he tells you any. He doesn't tell you anything. How can he be
except he
relevant?
anticipates it, right? 1428,
He knows
16:7.
he knows of the tradition, but he doesn't give us any details. So I
Okay.
don't know what to do with it. The other thing is that I don't know what to do with what you call multiple attestation of a motif here. I do work with that method sometimes, but in the present case, I am no longer sure that John hasn't heard the Gospel of Luke. So I recently published an article explaining my repentance. So I started out the very first session sharing that I fell in love with this field in part because of C.H. Dodd's historical tradition in the fourth gospel. And for 3 or more decades, he had convinced me. And a number of years ago, I worked through the problem again, and I decided that John had at least heard, maybe who knows how many times. I don't think John writes with the other gospels in front of him, but I do think John has heard Matthew, and I think he has heard Luke. And that means that multiple attestation with regard to Jesus eating or being touched may not be there. In other words, that may be something John is getting from Luke. but here's something else. I tend to work by starting out with skeptical presuppositions and trying to find what can persuade me. So, for example, I am on board with the idea, which I explain at great length, that the presence of the women in the story of the empty tomb is, in fact, evidence for it being ancient and historical. And that's because I think it works against the grain of the sources. Again, I decide in this book that there's some historical memory behind the doubt, the motif of doubt, which shows up any number of times. Now, here's the problem. The problem is that with regard to the women and the doubt, I can't come up with a story as to why those things, a good story as to why those things were invented or added later. But with regard to the physicality of the appearances, it makes sense to me that even if those things did not happen, it would not be unexpected to find them in the text because they serve apologetical elements. The Gospel of John is related to 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and there's some sort of interaction with a proto-Docetism or something like that. The importance of Jesus physically coming in the flesh is there in John's world. And in Luke, this serves an apologetical motif, that is, Jesus is not a ghost. And of course, that's one of the things people have always said. The disciples saw a ghost or they hallucinated or so on. And I would expect early Christians to come up with a counter to that at some point. So am I making myself clear here? There are motifs that repeat that are unexpected. And then there are motifs that don't surprise me. And the physical motif doesn't surprise me, and that's why I don't do much with it. Now, by the way, I think that the early Christians thought of this in physical terms, and I'm also not in any position to tell you exactly what happened, but that's why at one point I say I think these appearances were either, I'm hedging my bet, I say they are visions or vision-like, because they do have things in common with visions. Jesus just is there. That's what happens in visions. He's just not there. That's what happens in visions. He pops in through a room. That's what happens in visions. People don't know who he is. That often happens in vision. Who is this? What is it? There is doubt. So there are visionary-like motifs. So if you want to, you go with Pannenberg and say originally these go back to visionary experiences, but I actually am hedging my bet. I say these are either visionary experiences or visionary-like experiences, which means I just don't know what the heck is going on. But let me add also that, to repeat something I said earlier, I don't believe all visions are hallucinations. I believe that it is well, look, you're a Christian. You read the Bible. God throughout the Bible appears to people and communicates through visions. Acts actually calls Paul's experience a vision, right? So holding that things are communicated through a vision doesn't seem to me to be theologically out of balance. But anyway, that's what I would you see the point there? Things that are expected and things that are not expected. So that's one part to what you're doing. But there's
hold on, the visions thing. I just want clarification because you said we were going to get to this later on. If Jesus appeared to them as is narrated in the Gospels, would you include that under your definition of vision?
As it appears in the Gospels. What do you mean? You mean
as a bottle? He appears to them in like transformed physical corpse that he's with them, could be mistaken for an average human. He can cook for them. He can eat. They can touch him, converse with him.
So yeah, there we disagree. I don't know what happened, and I find it all very mysterious, and I have no idea what Jesus's post-resurrection ontological, metaphysical, bodily status is. By the way, did he have intestines?
Yeah,
Did he
I don't know. But
digest?
what I'm asking you is when you say he appeared to them in visions, visions can mean it usually when someone says that a lot of times they're referring to a
Yeah, but I
hallucination or
don't.
something.
I don't.
Or so what I'm asking you is when you say visions, could that include, let's just take the gospels at face value, the kind of appearance that they're describing in there? Would that your definition of vision, could it include that?
Yes, it could.
Okay.
It's an expansive definition, but look, I I don't want to say too much. I don't think anybody has any clue as to what Jesus's post-mortem body is like. I think most of us think that it was transformed into some other mode of existence, right? So where was Jesus between his appearances?
Yeah,
Was he
I don't
hiding
know.
in the bushes? Where was he? I don't think he was here. I think he was somewhere else. I think he's in a parallel universe or something really weird like that. And once you start talking about those sorts of things, you're in truly strange territory. But can I follow up with this multiple attestation thing?
Sure.
So yes, I have argued, and I continue to argue for this this idea that the multiple attestation of motifs is a good way to go about doing history with the Gospels. But multiple attestation, as it's typically practiced, raises questions for me. So the criterion of multiple attestation, as it's usually used, developed in the 20th century, and it came from people who had rejected the traditional authorship of the Gospels. So people used to say, well, we know there's history here because Matthew wrote Matthew, John wrote John, Mark got it from Peter. But the Germans in the 19th century began to doubt these traditions. And so you begin to have in the 19th and 20th century people who want to talk about Jesus, but don't think they have eyewitness accounts. So what they end up doing, among other things, is arguing, well, maybe we have some independent accounts here, right? Maybe we have Q and it's independent of John and they're independent of Mark and so on. And I thought about that for a long time, but there are two real big problems here. So first of all, there's a problem for evangelical scholars because I don't think any of these people are on traditional theories of authorship independent of each other. So if you think Mark was written by John Mark and Luke by Luke, they are together in Paul's epistles. They're hanging out together. They're talking to each other. And the author of Mark is talking to Paul on the traditional theory, and as well as Peter, and Luke is talking to Paul. They must be sitting around the campfire or the shop talking about these things off and on. And if Mark is getting some of his stuff from Peter, and you think John, the son of Zebedee, wrote John, well, heck, the first few chapters of Acts have Peter and John hanging out together, spending all sorts of time together. They're also together in Galatians. So if you want if you have a modern trial, what do you want to have from the witnesses? You don't want them to have post-event contact. You want to have truly independent witnesses. As far as I can tell, on the traditional theories of authorship, all these people are talking to each other all the time, so they're not truly independent in any way at all.
But Dale, they are with. Let's take what you just said there. But if it's true that they were hanging out with Peter and John, well, I mean, it's kind of like if you and I are having this discussion, and some students are coming up and they say, well, this is what Dale said, this is what Mike said. That's still independent sources, even if they were at the same events together.
I don't get that. I don't understand that because they're spending time together during the ministry after certain events happen. They're spending time together after Jesus is crucified. They're spending time together after Pentecost. They're just hanging out. They're swapping stories. They're getting their stories straight, consciously or unconsciously, it seems to me. I just think all of these people are in contact. The other thing is,
Mhm.
um, apart from authorship, um, I just think the early church wasn't that big a place. I don't think there were that many people in it before the year 50. I think there were leaders like Paul who were all over the place. He writes to Romans. He already knows a bunch of people in Rome. He's never even been there. I think all these people know each other. The way to think of this is in terms of this, social theory. How many degrees of separation are there between these people? And I would bet that there's no more than 1 degree of separation between Paul and every single person in the church up to AD 50.
Mm.
And if that's true for Paul, it's true for other people. So I haven't been able to think through this yet. It's something that I'm just working on now. But um,
Those are some
it,
interesting thoughts.
it
Especially, I'd
raises
never thought about the thing about Mark and Luke traveling together. That's,
all these guys are talking to each other.
yeah, yeah.
So how independent are they? There's another thing, Mike, and it has to do with eyewitnesses. So you know um, that when it comes to eyewitnesses, Richard Bauckham and I don't see eye to eye. So I fully concede that memory is wonderful and that for most practical matters it works and that it can be extraordinarily accurate. I have no doubts about that. Richard's right about that. But, I also know that memory can falter and be inaccurate. And it's really been important to me. Once I started reading the cognitive scientific literature on memory, I started paying attention to disagreements my wife and I had. And we would disagree over what we remembered from 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, a year ago, last month, last week, and yesterday. Once I noticed it, it happened constantly. And then I noticed it when our families got together and we would reminisce about old times and I'd ask questions and people would have different answers. So that's had a huge impact on me. I've also told stories and within a week heard someone else tell that story and it's already morphing into something else.
Mm.
I remember being at Duke as a graduate student and hearing a legend about Dale Allison told me by somebody who knew me, being spread by people who were there when I was there. It was not true, but
Mm.
people were spreading this story. And the fact that I said that didn't happen, I'm sure it didn't stop the spread of the story, right? So there's that. There's also is another fact. So you've spent a lot of time, I know, on Greco-Roman historical literature and biography and so on. I spend a lot of time in Christian hagiography, in
Mm.
lives of the saints and so on. So recently, for example, I was asked to write a paper on Simeon Stylites. He's the weird fellow several centuries after the first century who's in Syria and he stands on a pillar and he supposedly fasts for 40 days and 40 nights and so on. So um, there are 3 early biographies of this character, one written while he's still alive, but the one I'm interested in most was written within 14 years of his death. It was written by people who lived in his monastery or in the immediate area. It is full of information from eyewitnesses and people who knew Simeon. Now, the gist of my article was to argue that uh, against lots of modern historians, there is more history here than people think. But the thing is, this comes from Simeon's time and place, and it's full of stuff nobody believes, but the author clearly believed. So when you run into things like that, um, and when you spend a lot of time with those texts, as I have, you're just less sanguine about eyewitnesses. Okay, so that's also part of my presupposition. Uh,
Okay, fair
okay.
enough. I want to discuss horizon and bias with you, and I just want to say a couple things. I think you're a model historian here. I, what you do with this, I think you are so transparent. You are authentic. Um, I think you make a real concerted effort to get to truth, rather than to support any kind of a worldview. And I just want to say, I find it extremely rare, in New Testament studies to find someone as honest and is seeking truth to the extent that you do. And I really admire that with you. I want to quote a paragraph out of your 2005 book, Resurrecting Jesus, that illustrates this. Quote, we may justly suspect that many or even most New Testament scholars hold the view of Jesus that they do because it was instilled at them at a young age by their education. And once they came to see things a certain way, they found it difficult to change their minds. Intellectual inertia can be obstinate. Ask yourself, can you name any important historians of Jesus whose views in their 50s or 60s were radically different from their views in their 20s or 30s? If in the near future someone truly demonstrates that my sort of Jesus cannot be the historical Jesus, others would no doubt be quicker than me to home in on the truth. I would have to reconfigure my entire reconstruction of early Christianity, a task requiring courage and prolonged intellectual effort. Maybe I would not be up to it. I find this troubling. End quote. I just really appreciate you saying that, because it's true. There's a lot of truth in what you're saying there. And I want to point out that the observation that you're making there about New Testament scholars is not unique to New Testament scholars. The same year that you published that, 2005, sociology professor at Rice, Elaine Ekund, published results of some of her research regarding scientists. She had interviewed scientists at more than 1,600 elite research universities in the world. And what she found was that the beliefs of scientists about God are typically formed during their adolescent years or even younger, and before they chose science as their career path. So the beliefs largely of scientists are not the results of their research. It is something that they've just held throughout life. And it seems that this is something similar that's going on in New Testament studies. Any thoughts about that?
Well, yeah, so this is scary, it's disturbing, but I'm not a cynic here. So if I were a total cynic, there'd be no point in calling attention to this fact. I call attention to this fact so that we can be aware of it and try to do a better job. So Karl Popper, the famous philosopher, wrote a book called The Myth of the Framework. And I'm quite taken with this little book. What he argues is that we are not stuck in our worldviews, that we can, through what he calls criticism, actually be persuaded by evidence. That's the point of his book. So he recognizes that we usually stay within our frameworks, within our worldview, and so on. But he says that we have the magical ability to change our minds if we work at it, and if we're open and if we're honest, we pay attention to evidence. And I've seen this in my own life. So on this little podcast, if anybody was paying attention, they know that my view of John and the Synoptics is not the same that it was 40 years ago. And that was very painful to change my mind. It actually renders a number of my arguments in a lot of my books irrelevant, right? And now I'm thinking about this multiple attestation business. I don't know where it goes, but it's very unsettling. I changed my view about one of the arguments for the early tomb in this new book. I abandoned something I argued at length earlier. Bart Ehrman had said something in response, and I thought, yeah, Bart's right here. I need to get rid of this. This is not a good argument. So it is possible. It's possible to change your mind. I also have written a lot on Jesus and eschatology, his ideas of the last things, and in a book that will appear in a few years, I'm going to modify what I've been defending for several decades now. So it is possible to do this, right? It is possible. So, yeah, that's what I want to say. It's not impossible. We're not all stuck here forever. Okay.
Wow. Okay. Well, let's just close. Let's get away from scholarship and let me ask you one final question. And that is, I'm interested in knowing for your spiritual life, um, your fellow believer, what do you do? You know, we talk about quiet time, devotional time, where, you know, we're seeking God in prayer. Um, what do you do? Do you do that every day? What's it look like?
So I have a routine. It's a ritual. I do it ironically, every day except Sunday. Every day except Sunday. Sunday is supposed to be for church, although I've done a very poor job during COVID because I can't do church online. But so most mornings, what I do is I have this routine. I have a very long list of names of people for whom I pray. So you would call that intercessory prayer. And it's fairly perfunctory. I mean, there are some Lord have mercies and occasionally some added things, but it's mostly names and thinking about the people. Then the second thing I do, and by the way, I do this all lying on my back on a yoga mat. Okay.
Okay.
I've practiced yoga since the 1960s. I started when I was 10 years old. I've been a practitioner for 50 plus years. So I'm very comfortable on a yoga mat. So the second
Keeping
thing,
you strong and flexible.
yes. So the I don't think I've ever told people this. Oh, well, what the heck? There's nothing wrong with honesty, right? So every morning I go back to Wichita, Kansas, where I was born, and I go to my parents' backyard, to the first house I was in, and I'm playing in the backyard with my brother. I go there every morning, and my parents are watching from the kitchen, and then I enumerate all the things that they did for me. I think about how they taught me to walk and they taught me to talk. They introduced me to family and friends. They took me to the doctor. They prayed for me. They celebrated my birthday. I have this long list of things they did for me and gifts they gave to me that they filled my life with. And then I ask, what did they expect from me in return? And there are all sorts of answers, but the two answers that I think about every day are: one, they wanted me to learn. They expected me to learn. And two, they wanted me to be happy. So I meditate on those two things every day. And I also realize, since I learned the golden rule, I want other people to learn and be happy. So I think about how that works. Then when I'm done with that, I have an underground yoga studio to which I go. And this is probably too private and personal. So I have some weird exercises that I'm a sort of hesychast, if you know anything about Eastern Orthodoxy. And I have meditative exercises that involve visualizing what I call the light of Christ, or the light of Tabor on the Mount of Transfiguration. And during those exercises, I focus on my mind, on my heart, and on my body. From there, I go to church. I walk down to, I've constructed a church, my own church. I love icons. So it's an Eastern Orthodox church. And I walk down the street, I cross the street, I climb the first set of stairs, I climb the second set of stairs, I enter, shut the door. It's dark, it's quiet, it's peaceful, it's still. There are candles burning. I can smell incense, but there is no priest. There are no chanters. There are no congregants. And then what I do, without going into details, is I have I have 5 icons on the right, 5 on the left, and then I have 6 icons on the front and an icon on the ceiling. And I mentally stand in front of each icon every day and ask for its meaning for my life. So just to give 2 examples, as part of my salary here, I have this giant house here in Princeton, and we have people in. Before COVID, people stay here all the time. It's just like a hotel. And so the first icon is actually Abraham with Sarah and the 3 strangers, and all I do is say hospitality. I look at the icon, and one of the things I have to do is be hospitable, which is not easy. I'm an introvert. there's okay. So the second there's an icon of the Good Samaritan. I look at the Good Samaritan, and every day I say, love your neighbor as yourself, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The third icon is the crucifixion, and
Mm.
I look at it and I say, the Son of God suffers and dies. Then I say, the saints suffer and die. Then I say, all people suffer and die. Then I say, all creatures suffer and die. And then I say, I will suffer and die. Lord, have mercy. So I go around. Okay, so you get the point. I stand in front of icons and I think of what they mean. And then the last thing I do every day is I go back to Wichita, Kansas, and I say I was born in Wichita, Kansas. I will die in Wichita, Kansas. I was born in Wesley Hospital. I will die in Wesley Hospital. I am on my deathbed. And so on my deathbed, every day I look at the room, I talk to myself about what is in the room, and then I have this little ritual where I say, I'm on my deathbed, but I am not afraid. I am on my deathbed, but I am in the lap of luxury. I'm looking forward to having no more responsibilities. I really am looking forward to that. And once I'm on my deathbed, nobody's going to ask me anything. And then I say, I'm on my deathbed, but I am not afraid. Because I fought a good fight, I've run a good race, I have kept the faith, and then I say I'm not afraid because I am not alone, and then I think of the cloud of witnesses and the deceased, and then I look at my 3 children and my wife, and I want to leave them thinking certain things about me. I want to be a role model, so at that point I think about certain virtues. I use the 7 deadly sins. I actually use the old Boy Scout 12 virtues. I go through that. I think about the rabbis, repent a day before your death, and if not now, when, and so on. So that's my morning ritual. Takes about an hour. Of course, there's some mornings I don't have that much time, so there are abbreviated versions of it. But that's what I intend to do each day, and that's what I do every day. It's my own invention. It's my imagination.
That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. Thanks for sharing that. When do you expect your new book to come out?
March.
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 Awesome.
It'll be out in March. And by the way, if anyone's followed this, I forgot to say that press renamed the book.
Oh.
So I wanted Arguing Resurrection. I think it's just called The Resurrection of Jesus, but I think you had the subtitle right. Okay. But Amazon has, it's up on Amazon now.
Oh, okay. So people can pre-order it.
Yeah, if they want to. Yeah.
Okay. Sure. Well, I want to thank you for spending this time. We've gone a lot longer than I ever anticipated, but this has been great. I think our viewers are going to be very interested and pleased with what they've heard and learned about you. You're quiet. You're humble introvert, and I know from our discussions in the past, you do not like to do these, and the only reason you're doing this is to help promote the book. And Dale, this has just been such a pleasure, and thanks for doing this.
You're quite welcome, Mike. It's actually been enjoyable.
Well, I'm glad, folks. I've read through this book, the manuscript. I've endorsed this book. It really is a great book. So if you are serious in doing study about the resurrection, whether you're a skeptic, whether you're a Christian apologist, let me tell you, as a Christian apologist, you're going to have to learn how to address some of these things, like the rainbow bodies, etc., and interact with Professor Allison, because the arguments that he gives, because he has some really good stuff that he says in this book. So if you are someone who really is interested in the resurrection, this book is a must read. You have to get this book. Anyone who really wants to specialize in resurrection or know a lot about it, you have to read this book. It's really good. Thanks again, Dale. God bless you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.